Close your eyes for a moment and picture a British street in the 1950s. The morning milk float making its rounds, children heading off to school in their uniforms, and parked along every pavement, a row of modest, reliable, unmistakably British motorcars. These weren't exotic machines owned by the wealthy few. These were everyday vehicles, bought by ordinary families, driven by working men and women who simply needed to get from one place to another. And yet, somehow, they became far more than that. They became part of the landscape, part of the routine, part of life itself. But what made certain cars appear on virtually every street, in every town, across the whole country? That's exactly what we're exploring today, the 10 cars that truly dominated Britain's roads in the 1950s. And the one sitting at number 1? Well, its story might just surprise you. If this sounds like your kind of thing, do consider subscribing, there's plenty more where this came from. Let's begin with number 10. Number 10, Standard Vanguard. Introduced in 1947 and firmly established across British roads by the early 1950s, the Standard Vanguard was one of those cars you simply couldn't miss. It had a rounded, purposeful shape, almost American in its confidence, and it stood out in a sea of more modest offerings. You'd have spotted it parked outside factories, outside corner shops, occasionally outside the local working men's club. It was positioned as a practical family saloon, built for those who wanted something a little more substantial without stretching the budget too far. The Vanguard wasn't exactly luxurious inside, and its ride could be a touch firm on rougher roads. But what made it so common was straightforward: it offered reliability when reliability was everything. In post-war Britain, that single quality meant more than almost anything else. And this was only the beginning. Number 9, Hillman Minx. The Hillman Minx had been around since before the war, but it found its true stride in the 1950s, becoming one of the most recognized family cars on British roads. There was something deeply familiar about it: neat, sensible, unpretentious. You'd have seen it parked outside terraced houses in every corner of England, Scotland, and Wales. Families with young children gravitated towards it because it offered a practical amount of space without costing the earth. The interior was simple, perhaps even a little sparse, but it was honest in its purpose. And there were 1 or 2 rattles if you pushed it too hard. But the Minx wasn't built for speed, it was built for life. That distinction made all the difference. Would this have felt like the right car for your family back then? Number 8, Rover P4. Now here's where things shift slightly. The Rover P4 wasn't a car for everyone, but it was a car you noticed. Launched in 1949 and refined throughout the 1950s, it carried a certain quiet dignity that made it the natural choice of solicitors, bank managers, and senior clerks across the country. You'd have spotted it outside grammar schools on prize-giving day, or parked neatly along the drives of semi-detached houses in the better parts of town. It offered genuine comfort, a smooth ride, and a sense of occasion without venturing into outright extravagance. The P4 wasn't without its quirks. Mind you, it could feel a little stately for everyday errands. But that understated presence was precisely the point. And one car later in this list would take that idea of quiet respectability even further. Number 7, Vauxhall Velox. The Vauxhall Velox brought a hint of transatlantic flair to British roads in the early 1950s, and people rather liked it. It was bigger than most of its rivals, with sweeping lines that suggested something a little more glamorous than the usual offering. You'd have seen it parked outside the better sort of shops in market towns, or perhaps outside a dance hall on a Friday evening. It appealed to those who wanted comfort as well as presence, a salesman's car as much as a family one. The Velox was perhaps a touch thirsty on fuel, which wasn't ideal in an era of careful budgeting. But its sheer sense of occasion kept it firmly in demand. There's something worth remembering about that: the British public, even in lean times, still appreciated a little style. Number 6, Austin A40 Somerset. By the time the Austin A40 Somerset arrived in the early 1950s, Austin had already built considerable trust with British motorists. The Somerset continued that tradition quietly and without fuss. It was the sort of car that appeared outside suburban homes, parked beside garden gates, driven carefully to church on Sunday mornings. Families appreciated its neat proportions and its honest, unhurried character. The interior felt comfortable enough for a weekend run to the countryside, though it wasn't what anyone would call spacious. On longer journeys it could feel a little breathless, but week in, week out, it simply got on with the job, and that dependability earned it a place in driveways all across Britain. If you've made it this far, stay with us, because one of the cars still to come didn't just dominate the roads, it became part of British identity itself. And that car's story is something truly worth hearing. Number 5. Triumph Mayflower. The Triumph Mayflower was, in many ways, an unusual proposition, and yet it found a devoted following throughout the early 1950s. It had an almost formal appearance, with upright lines that borrowed something from much larger, more expensive cars. It felt, oddly enough, like a small car dressed in grander clothes. You'd have seen it parked along quiet residential streets, particularly in the Midlands and the South, where its compact size made it practical for narrower roads. It attracted buyers who wanted a touch of refinement without a steep price tag. The ride was a little choppy and the engine modest, but none of that seemed to matter particularly. What made the Mayflower stand out was its personality, and in the 1950s, personality counted for a great deal. Number 4. Ford Consul. Ford had a way of reading exactly what the British public wanted, and the Consul, launched in 1951, was a perfect example of that instinct. It was modern, well-proportioned and priced to reach a wide audience. You'd have found it outside schools, outside factories, outside post offices. It was a car that belonged to everyday Britain without any pretension whatsoever. Families valued its spacious interior for the time, and drivers appreciated its smooth handling on the roads of the era. The Consul wasn't entirely without fault. Its bodywork could suffer in damp conditions, as many owners discovered, but that was true of most cars in this period. What really made it so common, however, was Ford's ability to produce it in large numbers at a price ordinary people could genuinely afford. That reach was considerable. Number 3. Austin A30. The Austin A30 arrived in 1951 and quickly became one of the most familiar sights on British streets, a small, rounded, friendly-looking car that seemed perfectly suited to the pace of life in towns and suburbs across the country. It was economical to run, easy to park and cheap enough that it opened car ownership to people who had never seriously considered it before. You'd have seen it everywhere, outside fish and chip shops, parked along narrow terrace streets, waiting outside the local post office. The interior was compact, and passengers in the back seat required a certain patience, but nobody seemed to mind particularly. The A30 represented something important in British motoring history, the moment when the car became truly democratic. And yet, something even more significant was still to come. Number 2. Morris Minor. Few cars in British history have been loved quite the way the Morris Minor was loved. Designed by Alec Isagonis and already on sale since 1948, the Minor truly flourished throughout the 1950s, becoming as familiar a sight as the red telephone box or the corner post office. It was everywhere, outside cottages in the countryside, parked along cobbled high streets, sitting in the driveways of newly built semi-detached homes. Its rounded shape felt almost friendly, and its handling was genuinely impressive for a car of its size and price. The interior was modest, the engine small, and it wasn't always the quickest thing on the road. But none of that diminished its appeal in the slightest. The Morris Minor had something money couldn't manufacture, genuine warmth. But none of these quite match what's waiting at number 1. Number 1. Ford Popular. And here we are. The car that dominated 1950s British roads more completely than any other, the Ford Popular. Launched in 1953 at a price that genuinely astonished the market, the Popular did something remarkable. It made motoring available to millions of people who had never imagined they might own a car at all. It was simple, almost austere, with very few luxuries to speak of. No heater as standard, minimal instrumentation, a body style that looked slightly old-fashioned even on the day it was launched. And yet, it sold in extraordinary numbers. Because what it offered wasn't glamour or comfort or performance, it offered freedom. The freedom to travel, to explore, to carry the family somewhere new on a Sunday afternoon without relying on buses or trains. You'd have seen Populus on virtually every street in Britain, in every town, every village, every suburb. Can you picture those streets now, lined with their dark, upright little shapes, each one representing a family's first taste of independence? The Ford Popular wasn't just the most common car on British roads in the 1950s. It was the car that changed what ordinary life looked like. And there you have it, 10 cars that didn't just occupy Britain's roads but quietly shaped the texture of everyday life in one of the most significant decades of the 20th century. Post-war Britain was rebuilding itself, street by street, family by family, and the motorcar was part of that story in ways we perhaps don't fully appreciate today. These weren't status symbols or luxury items for most of the people who bought them. They were practical tools for living, for getting to work, for visiting family, for carrying children to school and neighbors to the shops. And yet, looking back, there's something genuinely moving about them. Something that speaks of optimism, of resilience, of ordinary people simply getting on with life and finding small pleasures along the way. Which of these cars do you remember from your childhood, or perhaps from the stories your parents or grandparents told? We'd love to hear your memories down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this journey back through the 1950s, please do give the video a like, it helps more than you might think. And if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, subscribing takes only a moment. Until next time, take care.